Welcome to another edition of the Norton Rose Fulbright Energy Transition, the Pace of Change interviews. My name is Jacqueline Heng. I'm based in our London office, and in relation to the energy transition, I focus on supporting clients in the green and transition bonds market. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Sean Kidney, CEO and co-founder of the Climate Bonds Initiative. Sean and his team focuses on promoting investment priorities for climate and green bonds, how governments can take advantage of the green bonds market, and the development of international collaborations. Sean, welcome today. Good morning.
Good morning, Jacqueline. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, we'd love to have you on. Thank you for joining us. So the CBI has been running for over 10 years, and the green bonds market is now tracking at over US dollars 1.2 trillion cumulative green bond issuance. When did you see the biggest step change in the market? And is the pace of change fast enough?
Well, patently, the pace of change is not fast enough. You know, if we're to achieve our 2030 necessary targets, which thankfully governments this year, for the first time, have stepped up and started adopting 50% cuts by 2030 in emissions globally. If we're to achieve that, we need to see some really radical changes, and that's going to require a lot of capex. You know, we need to change the way our cities look, feel, or run. They need much more pedestrian, bicycle, and mass transit focused. Certainly less petrol cars, but frankly less cars as well, because a density is carbon efficient. And we need to allocate more space to open area, to wilderness, to be honest, to return to natural capital as part of the change. Now, so there's a lot to be done. We're going to need to see capital flows of in the trillions, not what we're currently going to get this year, which is going to be a bumper year for green bonds. We're going to get about $500 billion, which is fantastic. It'll be about an 80% increase from last year. So that's cool, but we need to have 3 and 4 before the trillion, not half. So you can sort of see where we've got to go, right? To make a change. And of course, that flows onto equities and all other sectors. These are indicators of change. Underpinning that is how we achieve a change. But I'm going to say the biggest change there in how we achieve a change is this year. The pandemic, brutal as it's been for people, societies, and economies, has also been a wake-up call for many governments. We now do have Build Back Better as a mantra in multiple geographies. And we have strong 2030 targets, which we did not have 2 years ago. In fact, in terms of our 2050 targets, we now have 212 countries, sorry, my apologies, 112 countries committing to 2050 net zero, which is absolutely unbelievable compared to just 18 months before. So that's a big change. But what you're really asking is the green bonds market. I appreciate that. So let me go to that. The change is massive growth. And when I talk about massive growth, the issuance side is the symptom, not the point. The real issue is massive growth of investor demand, appetite and demand. And this is indication of what's happening across the board of investors. They've gone from being anxious deer in the headlights, which is what they were 10 years ago, worrying about long-term matching of assets and liabilities, but not knowing what to do about it, to realizing first, that the stuff they can do, invest in green bonds, for example, but not only, but that's one of the things. And as a result, we have a wall of money now behind this market. And I can tell you, someone talked to me from one of the central banks recently saying, how many bonds could we place if we had them? I said, look, we could place $10 trillion of green bonds next week if we had them. The demand is so strong, which is really, it's just an extraordinary difference. But there's another difference, another key thing about investors, which has grown as a result of their engagement of green bonds and other instruments and beginning to realize the opportunity, is they've started to realize, and I've had half a dozen conversations with CIOs of major funds in the last few months about this, that it's not just about shifting the deck chairs in the Titanic. It's not just about changing their own asset allocations. They have to get involved in shifting the course of the Titanic, hassling the captain. And that means they've got to band together to push other entities to aggressively change their strategies. We've seen that the Climate Action 100 campaign around companies. We've seen it, the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, and we're now seeing it with the discussion between governments and investors underway. And that gives me hope.
Yes, indeed. So what are the dynamics between debt capital flows and bonds in terms of speeding up the transition? Do you feel that that has definitely aided the transition?
You know, probably the major achievement of the green bond market is not growing green bonds. It's proving that this can be an opportunity, that this transition is not a burden. It's not, you know, we have to stop doing things and pull our belts in and whatever it might be. It's about shifting our economy to a different framework, a different setting. And then there's a lot of money to be made. And bonds are an example, you know, these meet current risk yield requirements and have as a bonus feature addressing climate, and they're working. They're working at scale. We have, you know, the issuance levels are growing dramatically. So I think that's the key thing, a shift from it's a problem to it's an opportunity.
Yes, indeed. So we have obviously seen significant growth in the renewable energy sectors, with investments pouring in also through green bonds and sustainable bonds. How do you think market participants in sectors such as oil and cement could also access funding for their energy transition pathways?
So we published a paper last September on financing critical transitions, which outlines a few of these issues. We need to ensure high carbon companies transition. Mm-hmm. But society needs steel, for example. It needs cement, but we cannot afford it to be the same as what we're doing now. It has to be different. And if it can't be different, it has no future. That's our challenge here. So showing pathways for change is a critical part of the solution, because there's a minimum level of ambition required. To give you an example, you know, in the car industry, if Volkswagen was to build a new diesel Golf plant outside of Duisburg, it would achieve about a 50% reduction in emissions, which sounds great, right? But actually, when we understand the level of emissions reductions we have to achieve in the transport sector, it's not good. It's not ambitious enough. And more to the point, if you invest in something not ambitious enough, you soak up the investment that could go to something more ambitious. So it's counterproductive. It's actually negative. Understanding what that minimal level of ambition that we need to achieve our targets is a really critical part of what we have to do. I want to say, by the way, that Volkswagen's building electric, so it's fine. They're fine. But that question comes up in many sectors all over the place. It comes up in the energy sector. You know, so for oil and gas companies, it's not just improvements count. It's actually whether the nature of what you're planning to do in your corporate strategy and your CapEx plan is commensurate with the ambition we have to achieve. And that is not a simple matter. That is not a simple matter. I can tell you that as a result of the net zero energy report that the International Energy Agency issued a couple of weeks ago, it is crystal clear there can be no new fossil fuel investments if we are to achieve our climate targets. No new fields, no new power, which pollutes, unless it's got carbon capture and sequestration. Now that's our learning. We have to take that. Now that means that if you're looking at climate policy at a national level or a corporate level, some things that were in there before can't be in there anymore. We have to shift. On the other hand, there is clearly now much more opportunity to have a hydrogen revolution, particularly for manufacturing and transport. We now think that green hydrogen, hydrogen generated from renewable energy, will be cheaper than natural gas within 10 years. 10 years, that's how fast it's going to change. And it could change faster because of a variety of things, including the cost of solar dropping so dramatically. Now, when that happens, look, is anyone going to buy natural gas if they can shift with the opprobrium attached to fossil fuels and natural gas? And what we're learning about the leakage out of the transmission system, the fugitive emissions, you know, it's game over. So, you know, like I say to people in the oil and gas sector, what are your transition plans? Are you investing in green hydrogen, not black or grey hydrogen, which is generated from coal or gas? That's a dead end. Are you investing in other sorts of businesses because you need to support the transition, But actually, from a risk perspective, you need to get out of a business which in 10 years is likely to be a dud. And I say to financiers in the gas industry now, if the gas company's got a long-term supply contract, fantastic, lock them in. But you won't see many long-term supply contracts now. We're shifting to 6-year supply contracts because the customers know that change is coming. And realistically, your gas investments have got a shelf life. It's a short shelf life. New gas investments that have got a 30-year ROI, like new LNG fields, highly dubious that's going to work. Highly dubious. If you're sweating existing assets, all good, but you've got a timetable to start working through. Now, this is new, right? This is a new feeling, and there's a whole lot more reasons why that's the case. But we've got to understand the two things: what we have to do, and actually what we're going to have to do because of all the other changes we're making happen.
Yeah. And we need to bring everyone on this journey with us on this energy transition, Correct. Even into difficult sectors.
I want to say, by the way, in transitions, that if a high carbon company were to be issuing bonds to finance low carbon investments, renewable electric charging, we're supportive. We want them. And we haven't seen that much, right? They've tended to be nervous and shy about it. Equally, if a high carbon company invests in something which is material to achieving the transition, let's say retrofitting gas pipelines to make them hydrogen ready, yes, we're a cheerleader. We will support. So there's a lot of things we can do for high carbon companies.
Yeah, that's good to hear. So, and have you seen the development of the sustainable bond markets evolve to cater to the needs of the various entities in our energy transition?
Well, no, not enough. And that's one of the reasons we're doing this transitional work. We want to bring in the high carbon companies who don't currently have a space, and people don't understand what a transition looks like. We need to flesh that out. I mean, the market's grown very well. It's served many markets, but it's a bit like an onion, I guess. We've started off with the relatively simple stuff. We've gone into transport, and I can still remember the first presentation we did on railway bonds as being low carbon bonds, which is about 10 years ago. And one investor came out to me afterwards and said, but isn't rail dirty? No, it's low carbon because it gets trucks off the road, etc. So expanding people's understanding of the extent of what's got to be done is a task we're continuing to pursue. The latest area is around grids. So in the European taxonomy and in the climate bond taxonomy, we're taking an approach to the inclusion of transmission grids, which is transmission and distribution investments for electricity, which has totally surprised the utility industry. We're saying, you know, it's not just about building a grid to a wind farm. And we've seen Tenant in Netherlands do a number of big green bonds for that, which is great. Because we've got to electrify everything, right? We need to get rid of all of those gas cookers in our homes. We need to get rid of petrol-based cars. All of this requires electricity. Actually, everything to do with enabling the flow of electrons is positive. So we're saying in our criteria, you know what? All that mainstream grid infrastructure needs to be brought into the green universe as well, unless it's specifically enabling fossil fuels, like a line to a coal-fired power plant, that sort of stuff. Now, I had one utility say to me, but my investors will never believe this. I mean, and that's, of course, our job and the job of the European taxonomy to make it clear to people what the next level of inclusion needs to be. And now we've got to go into other areas. What does it look like in the steel industry? What does it look like in the cement industry? And bring those appropriately ambitious investors into the eyesight of our investors and our sustainable investors. And to that extent, it's making a real contribution. But of course, we've got a long way to go yet.
Sure, yes, indeed. So what do you think are the biggest challenges in the energy transition? And if there was one thing that you think will speed up the pace of change, what is it and why?
We've had some wins. We've won on energy in terms of energy generation. It's really just how quickly we can make that play out. The speed is everything, by the way, in terms of averting climate change. So it's very material. But there is now no doubt on any substantive party that the future is clean and green. It's just now whether it's 2030 or 2040 or 2050. So we've kind of won that. And the reduction pathways in solar and wind, thanks to strong state action in Germany, Europe, and China in the last 20 years, that's now set. That's happening. Solar will be so cheap in 5 years, there is just no case for anything other than other renewable energies, to be frank. Just, there won't be a financially viable case for any kind of fossil fuel energy. So I'm not worried about that. We're winning, and we've nearly won on vehicles. Thanks to strong state action by the Chinese government and the help of a few landmark companies like Tesla, the price of EVs is plummeting. And every year it reduces, and reliability and range is increasing. I got a friend's EV the other day from Hyundai that's got a 500-kilometer range. That's this year's model. Goodness knows what next year's model is going to look like. So these things are going to change extremely quickly. I'm not so worried about transport. I am worried about land use. I think we've got to do something drastic in land use. The first task is going to be a proper way of funding the retention of forests, which we don't currently have. And that's probably going to be a targeted carbon tax or levy on high carbon industries that can't transition quickly, like aviation or maybe shipping. There's work to be done there. But the transition of our high carbon sectors that we still will need, some we don't need. Let's be clear about that. Fossil fuel extraction is a sunset industry. It has to go by 2040. And preferably sooner. But industries that currently rely on fossil fuels, like the steels and concretes and chemicals, for that matter, of the world, we need those. They have to transition. So finding the paths forward, that's the nut to crack at the moment. And you asked, in a sense, what a silver bullet might be. Well, in that context, when we're looking at industrial and to a certain degree transport, the silver bullet's hydrogen. So what I would say is, the faster we can get cheap green hydrogen in the market, the faster the world will transform. And whilst I think we are moving quite fast, we could move faster if we could rapidly aggregate demand, which is probably governments working together. If we could bring together large offtake agreements, I can tell you the producers, the people who are doing hydrogen plants in places like Saudi or Australia or Morocco, tell me they can reduce the price very, very quickly. It's entirely a scale game. So that's, for me, the exciting next step.
Okay, wonderful. Well, we look forward to hearing all about the exciting development of hydrogen as well, as I'm sure there'll be new technologies coming to us. So thank you so much, Sean. That has been really interesting. And thank you all as well for listening. If you want to hear more about the energy transition, subscribe to our channel and don't miss the next episode. Take care.
Thank you, Jacqueline.